May 28, 1940. The mood inside the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin was one of supreme confidence. France was collapsing under the weight of German panzers, and Britain looked weak and isolated. In that atmosphere of arrogance, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring sat at the head of a long oak table, an intelligence report in his hand. The report contained something remarkable. It detailed President Franklin Roosevelt's request to the United States Congress: the expansion of America's aircraft industry to produce 50,000 planes per year. Göring didn't bother to hide his scorn. He tossed the paper onto the table and chuckled, his voice dripping with contempt. The Americans are desperate if they believe such propaganda will frighten us. They know nothing of war production. Let them try to convert their automobile factories into aircraft plants. They will soon learn that building warplanes requires far more than assembly lines. His staff laughed with him, convinced their Luftwaffe, forged in years of conquest, would never be challenged by American amateurs. But Göring's laughter revealed more than arrogance. It exposed a fundamental blind spot in the German worldview. They could not comprehend American industry. They had no grasp of what mass production, once unleashed, could achieve. Across the Atlantic, Roosevelt's bold words echoed in Congress. "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." Even among allies, skepticism ran high. In 1939, America had produced just over 3,600 military aircraft. The Army Air Corps had only about 1,700 combat-ready planes, most already obsolete. Roosevelt wasn't asking for an increase. He was asking for a miracle, a 14-fold expansion of production. To the Germans, it sounded like a joke. To many Americans, it sounded impossible. Yet in the shadows of Detroit, a man who understood production better than almost anyone alive was preparing to prove Hermann Göring catastrophically wrong. And with that man, the most ambitious industrial transformation in human history was about to begin. On May 16, 1940, just 12 days before Göring's mocking laughter, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress. Behind him, Europe was unraveling. German panzers raced through France. The Low Countries were collapsing, and Britain faced the prospect of standing alone. Roosevelt knew that America could not afford complacency. With calm determination, he issued a challenge that seemed to border on madness. "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." To his audience, the number felt surreal. After all, the United States in 1939 had managed to build only 3,611 military aircraft in an entire year. At that time, the Army Air Corps possessed just 1,700 combat planes, and most of them, clumsy biplanes and underpowered bombers, were already outdated before they ever reached the runway. Now Roosevelt was calling for a 14-fold increase in production. Not a gradual expansion, not a cautious doubling, but an industrial leap so vast it sounded more like science fiction than a military plan. Even America's allies raised their eyebrows. British and French officials, desperate for help, whispered among themselves, "The Americans don't know what they're promising." They had seen American factories build cars and refrigerators, yes, but warplanes. Precision machines of aluminum, hydraulics, and engines fine-tuned for combat. To many in Washington, Roosevelt's words were nothing more than political theater, a way to boost morale while Europe crumbled. But to Roosevelt, it was deadly serious. He understood that the fate of the free world would not be decided by speeches, but by production lines. The president knew America had the raw ingredients: steel mills in Pittsburgh, automobile plants in Detroit, oil from Texas, and railroads stretching coast to coast. What was missing was leadership, the person who could turn those scattered resources into a coordinated arsenal. So Roosevelt turned to a man who embodied the American industrial story, a man born not in New York or Washington, but in Denmark, a man who had risen from a machinist's apprentice to the president of General Motors. His name was William Knudsen, and he was about to become the architect of Roosevelt's impossible dream. When Franklin Roosevelt set his near-impossible target of 50,000 planes a year, Washington insiders wondered who could possibly deliver such a miracle. The answer came from an unlikely source, a Danish immigrant named William S. Knudsen. Knudsen's story was pure Americana. Born in Copenhagen in 1879, he had come to the United States with little more than determination and a willingness to work. Starting as a mechanic in the bicycle and early automobile trade, he had climbed the industrial ladder with astonishing speed. By the 1930s, he was president of General Motors, the largest corporation on Earth. He knew how to build cars by the millions. He knew how to manage vast supply chains that stretched across states and industries. And he knew how to take raw steel, rubber, and aluminum and turn them into finished products faster than anyone else alive. That was why, in 1940, Roosevelt called him to Washington. Knudsen didn't come for prestige or power. He walked away from a salary of $300,000 a year, an extraordinary sum in Depression-era America, and accepted Roosevelt's offer to serve his adopted country for the symbolic wage of $1 per year. They called him the $1 man. His mission was simple in words, yet overwhelming in scale. Transform America's peacetime industries into the greatest war machine in history. From his very first day, Knudsen approached the task not as a politician, but as a production man. He visited auto plants, aircraft workshops, steel mills, and tool manufacturers. He sat down with executives and foremen alike, sketching out plans on scraps of paper. What he brought to Washington was something Germany fatally underestimated: the genius of mass production. The Germans sneered at Roosevelt's plan because they thought of airplanes as handcrafted works of engineering. They couldn't imagine them being built the way America built Chevrolets or Fords, rolling off an assembly line by the thousands. But Knudsen could. He knew that if Detroit could turn out 5 million cars a year, it could turn out tens of thousands of aircraft, if only the process was reorganized, standardized, and broken down into manageable steps. In a moment of rare praise, Roosevelt's advisor, Bernard Baruch, summed it up this way: who can possibly achieve this? First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. It was a recognition that no general, no congressman, and no bureaucrat could make this miracle happen. It would take the man who understood the heartbeat of American industry. As Knudsen set to work, Detroit began to hum with new energy. Automobile assembly lines were stripped down, redesigned, and rebuilt to handle bombers, fighters, and engines. Workers were retrained. Machine tools were reconfigured. Suppliers shifted overnight from consumer goods to military hardware. The transformation had begun, and within just a few years, the laughter of Hermann Goering would be drowned out by the thunder of American aircraft engines, filling the skies of Europe and the Pacific. As William Knudsen got to work, the heartbeat of America's transformation could be felt most strongly in one city, Detroit. For decades, Detroit had been the motor capital of the world, the proud home of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. Its factories had cranked out millions of cars, trucks, and tractors. But in 1940, under Knudsen's guidance, Detroit would be given a new name, one that would echo through history: the Arsenal of Democracy. The challenge was enormous. Car factories weren't designed to build airplanes. An automobile might contain 15,000 parts. A heavy bomber, like the B-24 Liberator, required more than 450,000 separate components. Precision was far greater. Tolerances were unforgiving. And yet, Knudsen believed that with the right organization, the same methods that built Chevrolets could build bombers. The centerpiece of this transformation was a bold project on farmland outside Ypsilanti, Michigan. In 1941, Henry Ford's company began constructing the largest factory the world had ever seen, Willow Run. The statistics sounded like something out of science fiction. The plant would cover 3.5 million square feet under a single roof. Its assembly line would stretch 1 mile long. The goal? To mass-produce the B-24 bomber the way Model Ts had once rolled out of Dearborn. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, nicknamed Cast Iron Charlie for his iron will, made a stunning promise. Once Willow Run reached full speed, it would build one B-24 every single hour. At that time, other factories were producing only one per day. But the dream was bigger than Willow Run alone. Across the nation, the great names of American industry threw themselves into the effort. Boeing in Seattle expanded its plants to churn out flying fortresses. Douglas Aircraft in California hired tens of thousands of new workers, building bombers on multiple assembly lines. North American aviation began producing fighters at a scale no one thought possible. Everywhere machine shops were retooled, suppliers reoriented, and new workers trained at breakneck speed. To the Germans, such things seemed impossible. Their worldview told them that democracies were weak, undisciplined, incapable of sustained effort. But what they failed to see was that America's strength lay not in authoritarian command, but in free enterprise mobilized for a common cause. And as the hum of new factories spread from Detroit to Seattle, from Long Beach to Fort Worth, Roosevelt's vision began to take physical form. The arsenal of democracy was no longer just a phrase in a speech. It was a reality rising out of concrete and steel. Still, nothing this massive could come without setbacks. The first bombers to roll out of Willow Run would be so flawed they had to be taken apart and rebuilt. Critics sneered, calling the plant Will It Run instead of Willow Run. But the story of America was never about instant perfection. It was about persistence, trial and error, fixing problems, then trying again. And that persistence was about to be tested as the factories pushed toward a goal the world thought could never be reached. When the Willow Run bomber plant first opened its doors in 1942, expectations were sky high. Newspapers called it a miracle in the making. Politicians promised that thousands of bombers would soon be rolling off its mile-long assembly line. Ford executives spoke confidently of a new era in aircraft mass production. But the reality on the factory floor was very different. The first B-24 Liberator to emerge from Willow Run in September 1942 was, in truth, a disaster. It took months to assemble, and when inspectors examined it, the aircraft had to be almost completely torn down and rebuilt. Quality control failures ran as high as 50%. The problem was simple. Building cars and building planes were not the same thing. Automobiles were rugged machines, forgiving of small flaws. A car could rattle down the road with a loose bolt and still get you home. But a bomber, at 25,000 feet, traveling hundreds of miles an hour, carrying tons of bombs, it demanded perfection. A single faulty rivet, a misaligned part, or a bad weld could mean the loss of a crew of 10 men. At Willow Run, workers faced the steepest learning curve imaginable. Many had never seen an airplane up close before, let alone built one. Some were farm girls from Michigan. Others were men too old or too young for the draft. All of them had to learn aircraft production from scratch. Mistakes were constant. Meanwhile, the press was merciless. Critics mocked the plant as a billion-dollar blunder. Instead of arsenal of democracy, they called it arsenal of delays. Jokes spread that Willow Run should be renamed Will It Run, a cruel pun on the constant breakdowns and bottlenecks. And yet, in the midst of failure, something important was happening. Ford engineers, guided by Charles Sorensen's relentless drive, began breaking down the bomber into sub-assemblies, smaller, manageable pieces that could be built separately and then brought together on the line. They developed new hydraulic riveting tools for speed and accuracy. They introduced prefabricated wiring harnesses, simplifying what had once been a nightmare of tangled cables. They even pioneered moving assembly techniques inside the aircraft itself. Each mistake led to a solution. Each setback forced innovation. By early 1943, Willow Run was still underperforming, turning out only 56 bombers per month against promises of hundreds. But by fall of that same year, production began to climb steadily. The workers were learning, the engineers were adapting, and the impossible was slowly becoming possible. What had started as a factory plagued by ridicule was transforming into something unprecedented, a true aircraft assembly line on the scale of Detroit's car plants. And the world was about to see what happened when America's persistence finally paid off. By early 1943, Willow Run was still being mocked as a failure. Politicians grumbled, newspapers scoffed, and German intelligence dismissed the plant as a hollow American boast. But behind the criticism, thousands of men and women in Michigan were grinding through the setbacks, determined to prove the doubters wrong. Then, in 1944, the breakthrough came. Piece by piece, the problems that had plagued the plant were solved. Engineers streamlined the assembly line. Toolmakers redesigned equipment for speed and accuracy. Foremen reorganized shifts into a relentless 3-crew rotation, keeping the factory alive 24 hours a day. Workers became seasoned experts, no longer fumbling with rivets or struggling with wiring. The results were astonishing. By September 1943, Willow Run was producing 148 bombers per month. By December, the number had climbed to 365 per month. And then, in April 1944, the dream Henry Ford and Charles Sorensen had promised became reality. Willow Run turned out 428 B-24 bombers in a single month, averaging 1 bomber every 63 minutes. Think about that. In the time it takes to watch a feature-length movie, a brand new 4-engine bomber was rolling off the line, ready to take flight. For the first time in history, an aircraft factory was outproducing the entire German aviation industry. A single plant in Michigan was building more bombers than Hitler's Luftwaffe could possibly replace. German officers at the front began to notice the change. Major Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most respected fighter commanders, remarked with grim clarity in late 1942, "The American pilots are no longer amateurs. Most disturbing, there are more of them every day." By 1943, that observation had turned into a nightmare. Every time the Luftwaffe shot down an American bomber, 2 more seemed to appear in its place. The math was merciless, and it only grew worse with each passing month. When Goering had laughed in 1940, the idea of 50,000 planes per year had seemed laughable. But by 1944, the United States wasn't just meeting Roosevelt's goal, it was smashing it. Nearly 100,000 aircraft a year were pouring out of factories across the country. For the men who flew in Europe, the difference was visible in the skies themselves. Where once a few dozen bombers had appeared over occupied France, now there were hundreds, streams of B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses stretching from horizon to horizon, guarded by swarms of American fighters. The Germans had underestimated the power of American industry. Now, with Willow Run leading the charge, they were paying the price in the most brutal way possible. By late 1942, the cracks in the Luftwaffe's confidence were beginning to show. At first, German pilots had dismissed American flyers as inexperienced and clumsy. But the air battles over North Africa and the Mediterranean told a different story. The Americans were learning fast, and worse for Germany, there were more of them every week. Major Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran ace, observed bitterly in Tunisia, "The American pilots are no longer amateurs." Most disturbing, there are more of them every day. That simple sentence carried a truth the German High Command was slow to accept. The Luftwaffe could not keep up. In January 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched their first raid against Germany itself, 64 bombers striking Wilhelmshaven. It was only a taste of what was to come. By the fall, the skies over occupied Europe were thick with American aircraft. The Germans quickly realized they faced an arithmetic problem no amount of courage could solve. In October 1943, on a day remembered as Black Thursday, 60 American bombers were lost in a single mission over Schweinfurt. Any other air force might have been crippled, But within just 2 weeks, those losses were completely replaced with fresh planes and fresh crews. The math was merciless. Germany was producing about 1,000 fighters per month, but losing 200. Meanwhile, America was producing 2,500 fighters per month, while losing only a fraction of that in combat. During Big Week in February 1944, the Americans mounted 3,500 bomber sorties in just 5 days, hammering German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe lost up to 355 fighters, and far worse, they lost nearly 100 veteran pilots, men who could never be replaced. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's fighter commander, reported grimly to Goering, "We are producing fewer planes than we are losing. Meanwhile, the Americans are producing more planes than we can destroy." The frontline pilots felt it in their bones. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's top aces with over 200 victories, described a January 1944 mission over Brunswick. The bomber stream stretched from horizon to horizon, at least 700 flying fortresses and liberators. We were 8 fighters against hundreds. It was hopeless. For the first time since the rise of the Third Reich, German airmen faced not just a superior enemy in the sky, but the crushing realization that their industrial base could never match America's. The grim truth had set in. The Luftwaffe was doomed, not by lack of skill or bravery, but by a tidal wave of American production that no amount of German determination could resist. By early 1944, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces were ready to unleash the full weight of America's industrial power. The skies over Europe were about to become the proving ground for Roosevelt's impossible dream. The operation would be remembered as Big Week. From February 20th to February 25th, 1944, wave after wave of American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators launched massive raids on Germany's aircraft factories, assembly plants, and repair shops. It was nothing less than an attempt to smash the backbone of the Luftwaffe once and for all. The scale was staggering. In just 6 days, the Americans mounted 3,500 bomber sorties, escorted by thousands of long-range fighters, including the new P-51 Mustangs. Over the skies of Leipzig, Augsburg, Regensburg, and Stuttgart, the German fighter force rose desperately to meet them. The battles were ferocious. German pilots fought with skill and courage, diving into dense bomber formations, braving storms of 50 caliber fire, and attacking again and again, even as losses mounted. But the math was inescapable. The Luftwaffe lost between 262 and 355 fighters during Big Week. More devastating than the planes were the men. Nearly 100 of Germany's most experienced pilots were killed in action. And here was the fatal truth. The Luftwaffe could replace machines, but it could not replace men. While American factories were producing 2,500 fighters per month, Germany's training schools were barely turning out green recruits with only a fraction of the flight hours once required. In 1939, a German pilot might have logged 250 hours before combat. By 1944, many were flying into battle with just 60 hours of training. General Adolf Galland reported soberly to Goering, "We are losing pilots faster than we can train them, and the Americans are producing planes faster than we can shoot them down." For the men in the cockpits, the imbalance was unmistakable. Veteran ace Heinz Baer recalled, "We faced bomber streams stretching from horizon to horizon. They could lose dozens of planes in a single raid and replace them in days. We could not replace even a handful." Big Week marked the moment the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed. From then on, Germany would fight a defensive air war it could never hope to win. For Hermann Goering, who had once laughed at Roosevelt's dream of 50,000 planes a year, the reality was now undeniable. American production had created an air force so vast, so relentless, that no strategy, no tactic, no bravery could stand against it. And in the months that followed, the bomber streams would only grow larger, filling the skies with the thunder of American engines and the symbol of a new world order being forged in aluminum and steel. By 1944, the United States had achieved something the rest of the world could scarcely believe. What Roosevelt had once declared as a dream, 50,000 planes a year, had been surpassed so thoroughly that it almost seemed unreal. The numbers told the story. In that single year, American factories produced 96,270 aircraft. Among them were 16,000 heavy bombers, 35,000 fighters, and 22,000 multi-engine transports and patrol planes. That was more than the entire German aircraft industry had managed in the entire war. Think about that for a moment. In just 12 months, America built more planes than Hitler's Reich had produced from 1939 to 1945 combined. The scale was beyond imagination. Boeing's plants in Seattle rolled out B-17 Flying Fortresses at a rate of 16 per day. North American aviation was producing 500 P-51 Mustangs each month, flooding the skies with one of the most effective fighters ever designed. Lockheed delivered a P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes, even while engineers worked through more than 2,000 combat-driven modifications. Douglas Aircraft, which had employed fewer than 100 workers before the war, now had 167,000 men and women on its payroll, spread across 9 sprawling facilities. And it wasn't just the airplanes themselves. The industries behind them had been mobilized at a scale that dwarfed anything Germany or even Britain could comprehend. General Motors built 57,000 aircraft engines under license. Packard produced 55,000 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, giving Mustangs and Spitfires their deadly edge. Alcoa increased aluminum production by 600%. Dow Chemical expanded magnesium output from 6 million pounds per year to over 300 million. Behind every bomber in the sky, every fighter escort, every transport delivering supplies, stood an industrial base that had been transformed into the most powerful manufacturing machine in history. For the Luftwaffe, the impact was devastating. German pilots reported climbing into fighters with only partial fuel loads or half their usual ammunition because factories couldn't keep up. Radios failed. Spare parts were scarce. Meanwhile, American bombers flew with powered gun turrets, precision bomb sights, and crews well-fed and well-trained. When a unit lost planes in combat, replacements rolled in almost instantly. Where Germany was shrinking, America was swelling into something unstoppable. The Germans had once laughed at the idea of mass-producing aircraft. Now they were being buried beneath the avalanche it created. This was no longer just a war between armies. It was a war of numbers, and America's numbers had reached a scale beyond imagination. Dehosse. Behind the roar of engines and the thunder of bomber streams was another miracle, one not of steel or aluminum, but of people. When Roosevelt called for 50,000 planes a year, skeptics asked not just where the factories would come from, but who would build them. By 1941, millions of American men were in uniform, shipped overseas to fight. That left a gaping hole in the nation's labor force. The answer came from a source the Germans never expected: America's women. At the start of the war, women made up less than 1% of the aircraft workforce. By 1943, they accounted for 65%. That meant more than 310,000 women were working in aircraft factories, building the very machines that filled the skies of Europe and the Pacific. This wasn't just an adjustment, it was a revolution. Take Willow Run, for example. Of its 42,000 employees, more than half were women. Many had never held a factory job before. Some were farm wives. Others had been waitresses, teachers, or homemakers. Now they stood side by side with men, drilling rivets, wiring instrument panels, and operating heavy machinery. One of them became an icon. Her name was Rosie the Riveter. Based on real women like Rose Will Monroe, Rosie symbolized the millions who traded aprons for overalls, lipstick for safety goggles. At Willow Run, Rose Monroe drove thousands of rivets into bomber fuselages with 99.5% accuracy, a level of precision that silenced any doubts about whether women could handle industrial work. And the results spoke for themselves. At Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach plant, women inspectors reduced defect rates from 3.2% down to 0.3%. At Ford, engineers redesigned tools to fit smaller hands, which unexpectedly improved efficiency for everyone. Pneumatic drills were made lighter, reducing fatigue and injuries. Production actually improved because of these changes. The Germans, blinded by ideology, misread this transformation completely. Nazi intelligence dismissed reports of women working in American factories as a sign of desperation. They believed female workers would cripple production. Instead, they elevated it. And there was something else: morale. For women who entered the factories, this wasn't just about paychecks. It was about purpose. They knew their hands were building the planes that would protect their husbands, brothers, and sons overseas. Every rivet, every welded seam, every inspected part was an act of patriotism. When German pilots looked up at bomber formations stretching from horizon to horizon, they weren't just facing American industry. They were facing the combined determination of American families, the men on the front lines, and the women who had turned factories into fortresses of democracy. In the end, Rosie the Riveter was more than a poster. She was the face of an unstoppable workforce revolution, one that the Luftwaffe could never outfight, no matter how many aces they sent into the sky. By 1944, the true weight of America's industrial miracle could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just statistics on paper. It was visible every single day in the skies over Europe. German fighter pilots, many of them hardened veterans of Poland, France, and Russia, had once sneered at American machines. They had mocked the heavy, lumbering bombers, laughed at Roosevelt's bold promises, and believed that Luftwaffe skill would sweep these clumsy amateurs from the skies. But now, when they strapped into their Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, what they saw above them left even the most seasoned aces stunned. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's top scorers with more than 200 victories, recalled flying toward a bomber stream over Brunswick in early 1944. The bombers stretched from horizon to horizon. At least 700 flying fortresses and liberators, with fighters circling them like hawks. We were 8 men against hundreds. It was hopeless. For the first time, Luftwaffe aces felt small. No matter how bravely they fought, no matter how many bombers they set aflame, the sky never seemed to thin. Each raid brought more aircraft than the last. Worse still, the bombers weren't alone anymore. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed everything. These long-range fighters escorted American bombers all the way to Berlin and back. To German pilots, it was a nightmare. Once, they could strike the bombers and dive away before escorts reached them. Now, Mustangs were waiting, diving out of the sun, their Merlin engines roaring, their 50 caliber guns shredding German fighters by the dozens. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out. Each lost pilot represented years of training that Germany could no longer afford. Young replacements, barely taught to fly, some with less than 70 hours in the cockpit, were being thrown into battles they could not survive. They faced waves of Americans who were not only well-trained, but supported by an endless stream of replacements. For those who survived the battles, the shock went beyond combat. Prisoners of war spoke of their disbelief when they saw how quickly America replaced its losses. A squadron could lose 20 bombers in one raid, and 2 weeks later, the unit was back to full strength. To German officers, this was unthinkable. In the skies, arrogance had turned to despair. Goering's Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, was now being torn apart by a storm of metal and fire. Aircraft built by American workers, flown by American crews, and supported by an industrial base larger than anything in history. The laughter of 1940 had vanished. In its place was the stunned silence of pilots who realized that no matter how well they fought, they were facing an enemy that could not be outproduced, outlasted, or overwhelmed. The shock in the skies of Europe was not just tactical, it was psychological. German pilots no longer asked if they could stop the Americans. They wondered only when their defeat would come. It had begun with laughter. On that day in May 1940, Hermann Goering had chuckled at Roosevelt's words, certain that America could never produce 50,000 planes a year. He saw a nation of car builders and consumer goods, not warriors. To him, the United States was soft, decadent, incapable of the kind of disciplined production that Nazi Germany prided itself on. But by 1944, the laughter had died. Instead of 50,000 planes a year, America was building nearly 100,000. Instead of struggling to keep up, the United States had become the arsenal of democracy, producing not only for itself, but for its allies across the world. Factories that once turned out sedans and refrigerators were now rolling out bombers, fighters, and engines at a pace the Germans couldn't even begin to imagine. Women who had never touched a rivet gun were now producing aircraft with greater precision than German engineers had predicted possible. And in the skies, German aces, once the terror of Europe, were overwhelmed, not by a lack of skill, but by the sheer weight of American industry. The meaning was clear. World War II was not won by generals alone, nor by battles fought on beaches and in forests. It was won in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of Richmond, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and the endless assembly lines of Willow Run. It was won by men like William Knudsen, who gave up fortune and comfort to serve his adopted country for $1 a year. It was won by Rosie the Riveter and millions like her, who proved that patriotism could be measured not only in combat, but in sweat, grit, and precision on the factory floor. And in the end, it was won by the vision of a president who dared to dream the impossible, and a nation that made that dream real. For Germany, the war in the air became a grim lesson. Arrogance is no substitute for reality. Goering's laughter in 1940 was the sound of a man blind to what America could achieve when challenged. His silence in 1944 was the silence of defeat. For the United States, the legacy is something deeper. It is the reminder that when the nation unites, when free people commit their hands, their minds, and their will, there is little that cannot be achieved. The story of America's 100,000 planes is not just about victory in World War II. It is about what happens when determination meets industry, when courage meets innovation, and when ordinary citizens rise to extraordinary demands. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that freedom, once roused, can outproduce tyranny, outlast aggression, and outfight despair. So when we look back at Goering's laughter, we should not hear arrogance. We should hear the opening note of a story that ended with the skies of Europe filled with American planes, proof that the impossible can be done if a nation believes in itself. And that brings us to the end of today's story. What do you think? Did Goering's arrogance seal Germany's fate from the very beginning? Or was it America's factories and workers that truly won the war? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the untold stories of World War II. We've got many more incredible tales coming, stories of courage, mistakes, and moments that changed history forever. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.